The morning mist clung to the waters of New York Harbor like a shroud of impending doom. General George Washington stood at the window of his headquarters in Brooklyn Heights, watching the largest armada ever assembled in American waters take shape in the distance. It was August 27th, 1776, and the fate of the fledgling American Revolution hung in the balance. The sight before him was both magnificent and terrifying. British warships stretched across the horizon like floating fortresses, their masts creating a forest of wood and canvas that seemed to block out the very sky. Admiral Richard Howe's fleet had been gathering for weeks, and now it numbered over 400 vessels carrying the most professional army in the world. The crimson uniforms of British regulars gleamed in the early morning light as they prepared for what many believed would be the decisive battle of the war. Washington's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the windowsill. The weight of command had never felt heavier. His Continental Army, numbering roughly 19,000 men, was a motley collection of farmers, merchants, and laborers who had answered the call to arms. They were brave, certainly, but they lacked the discipline and experience of their British counterparts. Many had never seen real combat, and their equipment was a patchwork of hunting rifles, farm tools converted to weapons, and whatever military supplies they could scrounge. The British commander, General William Howe, brother to the admiral, commanded over 32,000 troops. These were not colonial militiamen, but seasoned veterans of European warfare. The sight of their perfectly aligned formations and gleaming bayonets had already caused several American units to desert during the night. Washington knew that in a direct confrontation, his army would be crushed like wheat before a scythe, but retreat was not an option. New York was the key to controlling the Hudson River and splitting the colonies in half. If the British could secure Manhattan and Long Island, they would effectively cut New England off from the rest of the rebellious colonies. The Continental Congress had made it clear New York must be held at all costs. According to historical accounts from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the strategic importance of this battle cannot be overstated, as it represented the first major test of the Continental Army against the full might of the British Empire. Washington's most trusted generals had gathered in the pre-dawn darkness to finalize their defensive strategy. General Nathanael Greene, despite suffering from fever, had helped plan the fortifications along Brooklyn Heights. General John Sullivan commanded the right wing, while General William Alexander, who insisted on being called Lord Stirling despite his disputed Scottish title, held the left. These men understood the gravity of their situation. They were not just fighting for territory. They were fighting for the very idea that common men could govern themselves. The American positions were formidable in theory. The Continental Army had spent weeks digging trenches and building redoubts along the heights of Guam, a ridge that ran across the southern portion of Long Island. These fortifications commanded the approaches to Brooklyn and Manhattan, creating what Washington hoped would be an impregnable defensive line. Behind them, the East River provided a natural barrier, though it could also become a trap if retreat became necessary. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of drums and fifes began to echo. Across the water, the British were beginning their advance. Washington closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer. He had committed his army to this battle, and there was no turning back. The next few hours would determine whether the American Revolution would continue or die stillborn. On the fields of Long Island, the fate of a continent hung in the balance, and George Washington knew that history would judge him harshly if he failed. The fog of war descended upon Long Island with the literal fog of the August morning. General William Howe had spent the night orchestrating what he believed would be the masterstroke that would end the American rebellion in a single, decisive blow. His plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. While the Americans focused their attention on the obvious routes of attack, Howe would exploit their greatest weakness, their unfamiliarity with the local terrain. The British strategy relied heavily on intelligence gathered from loyalist farmers who knew every path, stream, and hidden trail on Long Island. These local guides had revealed to Howe the existence of the Jamaica Pass, a lightly defended route through the heights of Guam that would allow his forces to outflank the entire American defensive line. It was a gamble that required perfect timing and coordination, but if successful, it would trap the Continental Army between three advancing British columns with nowhere to retreat, except into the East River. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Howe himself led a column of 10,000 British and Hessian troops along the Jamaica Road. The march was conducted in complete silence. with orders to shoot any man who made unnecessary noise. The British regulars moved like ghosts through the darkness, their years of training evident in every carefully placed step. Behind them came the Hessian Grenadiers, tall German mercenaries whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had preceded them across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, General James Grant led 5,000 troops in a diversionary attack against the American right wing at the Gowanus Road. The sound of musket fire and artillery erupted in the pre-dawn darkness immediately, drawing the attention of the American commanders. General William Alexander, Lord Stirling, responded exactly as Howe had hoped, rushing reinforcements toward the sound of battle. The American left wing, commanded by General John Sullivan, also began shifting troops to support what appeared to be the main British assault. The deception was working perfectly. As the morning sun began to burn away the fog, American lookouts could see British formations advancing in force along the coastal road. The red uniforms of the King's troops stretched in long lines across the landscape, their bayonets glinting in the sunlight. Artillery pieces rolled forward, their crews preparing to blast holes in the American defenses. To the defenders on Brooklyn Heights, it appeared that the British were launching a frontal assault exactly where they had expected, but the trap was already closing. Howe's flanking column had covered nearly 12 miles in the darkness, moving through terrain that the Americans had left virtually undefended. The few Continental sentries posted along the Jamaica Pass were overwhelmed before they could raise an alarm. By 6 o'clock in the morning, British forces had seized the vital crossroads at Bedford, placing them directly behind the main American defensive line. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came when American officers began hearing the sound of British bugles and drums behind their positions. The realization struck like a thunderbolt. They had been outflanked. The carefully prepared defensive positions along the heights of Guam were now facing the wrong direction. Instead of fighting from prepared fortifications, the Continental Army found itself caught in the open between multiple British columns. Historical documentation from the National Archives reveals that the coordination between the British columns was nearly flawless, demonstrating the professional military expertise that the Continental Army so desperately lacked. General Sullivan's men were the first to realize the magnitude of the disaster. As British forces poured through the Jamaica Pass, Sullivan attempted to wheel his troops around to face the new threat, but his men were militia and volunteers, not professional soldiers. The complex maneuver required to change front while under fire was beyond their capabilities. Units became confused, officers lost contact with their commands, and what should have been an orderly redeployment became a chaotic scramble. The sound of battle grew closer with each passing minute. British artillery began finding the range, sending cannonballs crashing through the American ranks. The professional British infantry advanced with mechanical precision, their bayonets fixed and their formations intact despite the rough terrain. The sight of these disciplined troops advancing inexorably forward struck terror into the hearts of many American soldiers who had never faced such an enemy. The Maryland 400 stood like a thin red line against the tide of British steel and iron. As the morning of August 27th unfolded into a nightmare of confusion and retreat, these brave men from the Chesapeake Bay region found themselves facing impossible odds. General William Alexander, Lord Stirling, had positioned his Maryland and Delaware regiments to hold the Gowanus Road, but now they faced not just the frontal assault they had prepared for, but the crushing weight of General Howe's masterful flanking maneuver. The sound of battle echoed across the marshlands and farm fields of Long Island like thunder. That would not cease. British artillery had found its mark, sending plumes of earth and smoke skyward with each devastating salvo. The professional British infantry advanced with the measured cadence of men who had fought in Europe's bloodiest conflicts. Their bayonets caught the morning sun, creating a forest of steel that promised death to any who stood in their way. Lord Stirling understood the gravity of the situation with painful clarity. His forces were outnumbered 3-1, outflanked, and facing professional soldiers who had never known defeat, but retreat was not an option. Behind him, the bulk of Washington's army was trying to reach the safety of the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. Someone had to buy them time, and Stirling knew that his men were the only force capable of holding the British advance long enough for the main army to escape. The first British assault came at 9 o'clock in the morning. General James Grant's troops, fresh from their diversionary attack, now pressed forward with renewed vigor. The sound of musket fire erupted along the entire line as American and British soldiers exchanged volleys at close range. The acrid smoke of black powder filled the air, creating a choking fog that made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Major Mordecai Gist of the Maryland Regiment stood in the center of the line, his sword raised high as he encouraged his men. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and merchants who had left their homes to fight for liberty. Many were barely out of their teens, and the sight of British bayonets advancing through the smoke tested their courage to its limits. But they held their ground, loading and firing with a determination that would have made their British counterparts proud. The Delaware Blues, commanded by Captain Thomas Rodney, anchored the right of Sterling's line. These men had marched from the banks of the Delaware River to fight for independence, and they were determined not to let their sacrifice be in vain. As British grenadiers advanced through the marsh grass, the Delaware men met them with steady musket fire that dropped the enemy's soldiers like wheat before a scythe. But numbers and professional training began to tell. The British had artillery support, and their gunners were among the finest in the world. Round after round crashed into the American positions, tearing gaps in the defensive line that the British infantry quickly exploited. The famous Maryland line, which would later become known as the backbone of the Continental Army, was slowly being ground to pieces by superior firepower and overwhelming numbers. As documented in the Journal of the American Revolution, the heroism displayed by these men became legendary among the Continental Army and helped establish the reputation of Maryland troops as among the finest in American service. Lord Stirling realized that his position was becoming untenable. British forces were advancing from 3 directions, and his ammunition was running low. The time had come for desperate measures. He gathered his remaining officers around him and made a decision that would echo through American military history. Rather than surrender or retreat in disorder, he would lead his men in a series of charges designed to break through the British lines and reach the safety of Brooklyn Heights. The first charge came at 11 o'clock. 250 Maryland soldiers, led by Major Gist, fixed bayonets and advanced directly into the teeth of British fire. The sight was both magnificent and heartbreaking. These citizen soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat before, this day charged with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They crashed into the British line with such force that they actually drove the professional soldiers back, creating a gap through which some of the trapped American forces could escape. But the charge came at a terrible cost. British muskets and artillery cut down the Maryland men in droves. Major Gist watched in horror as his boys fell around him, their blood staining the earth of Long Island. Yet still they pressed forward, driven by courage and desperation in equal measure. The British, despite their superior training and equipment, found themselves facing an enemy whose determination they had not expected. From his position on Brooklyn Heights, General George Washington watched the destruction of his army through a telescope that trembled in his hands. The morning sun, which had risen with such promise, now illuminated a scene of carnage that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The carefully laid plans, the weeks of preparation, the hopes of a nation, all were crumbling before his eyes as the British Army demonstrated why it was considered the finest military force in the world. The sound of battle rolled across the East River like distant thunder. But Washington could see the reality behind those sounds. His brave soldiers, many of them boys who had left their farms to fight for liberty, were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that possessed every advantage: superior numbers, better equipment, professional training, and the tactical genius of General William Howe. The American Revolution, which had begun with such hope at Lexington and Concord, appeared to be dying on the fields of Long Island. Reports from the battlefield arrived in a steady stream of increasingly desperate messages. General John Sullivan's right wing had been completely outflanked and was in full retreat. Many of his men had been captured, including Sullivan himself, who had been taken prisoner while trying to rally his troops. The center of the American line, commanded by General Samuel Parsons, was holding for now. But British pressure was increasing with each passing hour. Most heartbreaking of all were the reports of Lord Stirling's heroic stand. Washington could see the smoke rising from the Gowanus area where the Maryland and Delaware troops were making their last stand. Through his telescope, he could occasionally catch glimpses of the fighting, flashes of musket fire, the glint of bayonets, the red uniforms of British soldiers advancing inexorably forward. He knew that brave men were dying down there, buying time with their lives for the rest of the army to escape. The general's staff gathered around him, their faces grim with the realization that the revolution might end here, on this August morning. In 1776, General Nathanael Greene, despite his illness, had managed to join Washington on the Heights. His fever-brightened eyes reflected the same anguish that Washington felt. They had gambled everything on holding New York, and the gamble was failing catastrophically. "Sir," said Colonel Joseph Reed, Washington's military secretary, "we must consider evacuation. The British fleet controls the rivers, and if General Howe completes his encirclement, the entire army will be trapped." Reed's voice was steady, but Washington could hear the underlying desperation. They all understood the implications. If the Continental Army was destroyed here, there would be no second chance. The revolution would be over before it had truly begun. Washington nodded grimly, but said nothing. The decision to evacuate was not his alone to make. The Continental Congress had been clear: New York must be held. But as he watched the systematic destruction of his forces, he realized that sometimes a general must choose between following orders and preserving his army to fight another day. The question was whether there would be enough of his army left to evacuate. Intelligence reports from the battlefield painted an increasingly dire picture. British forces had secured the Jamaica Pass and were advancing toward the American rear. The Hessian troops, fighting alongside their British allies, were proving to be every bit as formidable as their reputation suggested. These German mercenaries showed no mercy to their American opponents, and stories of their brutal efficiency were already spreading through the ranks, causing panic among the less experienced troops. Research from the Museum of the American Revolution indicates that Washington's leadership during this crisis was crucial in preventing the complete collapse of American morale and maintaining some semblance of military organization during the retreat. The situation was complicated by the presence of civilians. Brooklyn and the surrounding areas were home to thousands of people, many of whom had supported the American cause. If the British occupied the area, these civilians would face retribution from both British forces and their loyalist neighbors. Washington felt the weight of responsibility not just for his soldiers, but for all the innocent lives that would be affected by his decisions. As the afternoon wore on, the reports became even more desperate. Lord Stirling's brave stand was finally collapsing. The Maryland troops had fought with incredible courage, but they were being overwhelmed by superior numbers. British artillery was beginning to find the range of the American positions on Brooklyn Heights itself. Soon, the British would be able to bring their guns to bear on the American fortifications, making the position untenable. The most crushing blow came when a blood-covered messenger arrived with news that made Washington's heart sink. The British fleet was moving to positions that would cut off any retreat across the East River. Admiral Richard Howe was coordinating with his brother to complete the encirclement of the American forces. If the British could position their warships properly, they would control all the waterways around Manhattan and Long Island, trapping the Continental Army like fish in a net. Washington removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual during moments of extreme stress around him. His officers waited for orders, but what orders could he give? The battle was lost. His army was being destroyed, and the revolution itself hung by a thread. Yet somehow, he had to find a way to save what remained of his forces and continue the fight. The fog that rolled in from the East River on the night of August 29th was thick enough to cut with a knife, and to General George Washington, it seemed like the hand of Providence itself reaching down to aid the American cause. For 2 days, his army had been trapped on Brooklyn Heights, surrounded by British forces that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. The situation appeared hopeless, but Washington had conceived a plan so audacious and desperate that it could only succeed through a combination of perfect timing, incredible courage, and divine intervention. The evacuation of the Continental Army from Long Island would later be called one of the greatest military retreats in history. But as Washington stood in the pre-dawn darkness of August 30th, he knew only that thousands of lives depended on his ability to move 9,000 men across a treacherous river. Under the noses of the British Navy, the East River, which had seemed like a protective barrier just days before, had become a trap that could destroy the American Revolution. If the evacuation failed, the plan required absolute secrecy and perfect coordination. Washington had spent the previous day quietly gathering every boat, barge, and ferry he could find on the Manhattan side of the river. The task fell primarily to Colonel John Glover and his regiment of Marblehead fishermen, men who knew boats and rough water better than any soldiers in the Continental Army. These hardy New Englanders had spent their lives battling the North Atlantic and now they would use their skills to save the revolution. The evacuation began at 9 o'clock on the evening of August 29th. The first boats to cross carried the wounded and the artillery, precious cannons that Washington could not afford to lose to the British. The sound of oars cutting through the dark water was muffled by careful rapping, and the boats moved like ghosts through the fog. Each crossing took nearly an hour, and with thousands of men to evacuate, time was running desperately short. The British, incredibly, seemed unaware of what was happening. Their sentries, posted along the Brooklyn shore, could hear movement in the American camp, but attributed it to normal military activity. The thick fog that had rolled in from the ocean made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. British patrols moved carefully through the mist, but they were as blind as the Americans they were hunting. General Washington positioned himself at the ferry landing, personally supervising the embarkation of his troops. He stood in the darkness for hours, a tall figure wrapped in his military cloak, watching as regiment after regiment disappeared into the fog. The sight of their commander, calm and resolute despite the desperate circumstances, gave courage to soldiers who had every reason to panic. Many of these men had never been in a boat before, and the thought of crossing the treacherous East River in darkness terrified them more than British bayonets. The Marblehead men worked with quiet efficiency, their boats appearing and disappearing in the fog like phantoms. Colonel Glover moved among his sailors, offering quiet encouragement and coordinating the complex dance of boats, men, and equipment. These fishermen had become the unlikely saviors of the American cause, their knowledge of wind and tide proving more valuable than all the military textbooks in the world. As documented in the Smithsonian Magazine, the evacuation was complicated by changing weather condition and the need to maintain absolute silence while moving thousands of men and their equipment across nearly a mile of open water. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Each boat that returned to the Brooklyn shore brought Washington closer to safety, but also closer to dawn and the inevitable discovery of the evacuation by British forces. The general knew that if the British realized what was happening, they could easily move artillery to the waterfront and turn the East River into a killing field. Worse yet, British warships were anchored in the harbor, and their captains could position their vessels to prevent any further crossings. By 3 o'clock in the morning, roughly half the army had been evacuated. The pace was accelerating as the Marblehead men found their rhythm, but Washington was growing increasingly anxious about the approaching dawn. The eastern sky was already beginning to show the first faint traces of light, and British patrols were becoming more active. Several times during the night, enemy soldiers had approached close enough to the American positions to hear the sound of movement, but the fog had concealed the true nature of the activity. The most dangerous moment came when a British patrol stumbled upon a group of American soldiers waiting to board the boats. The sound of voices and the clash of weapons cut through the fog, and for a terrifying moment, Washington thought the evacuation had been discovered. But the American soldiers, many of them veterans of the fighting on Long Island, quickly overwhelmed the British patrol. The prisoners were taken across the river to prevent them from raising an alarm. But Washington knew that luck would not hold forever. As the sky began to lighten, the last regiments prepared to embark. These were the men who had been holding the outer defenses, maintaining the illusion that the American army was still in position. They were also the men who would have the least time to reach the boats. If the British discovered the evacuation, Washington had personally selected these final units, choosing soldiers he knew would maintain discipline under pressure and cover the retreat of their comrades. The general himself was among the last to leave Brooklyn Heights. As his boat pulled away from the shore, he looked back at the fortifications that had cost his army so dearly. The earthworks and redoubts were empty now, but campfires still burned to maintain the deception. In a few hours, British patrols would discover the truth, but by then, the Continental Army would be safely across the river, ready to fight another day. The first light of dawn on August 30th, 1776, should have illuminated the complete destruction of the Continental Army. Instead, it revealed one of the most audacious deceptions in military history. As British sentries peered through the dissipating fog toward the American fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, they saw what appeared to be a fully manned defensive position. Campfires burned brightly, sentries could be seen moving along the ramparts, and the occasional sound of voices carried across the morning air. To British eyes, it appeared that the rebellious colonials were still trapped in their earthworks, waiting for the final assault that would end their revolution. The illusion was masterful in its simplicity. Washington had left behind a skeleton force of his most trusted soldiers, men who understood that their lives depended on maintaining the deception for as long as possible. These brave souls moved constantly along the defensive lines, creating the impression of a much larger force. They built up the campfires, called out challenges to imaginary comrades, and even conducted mock inspections that could be observed from British positions. General William Howe, confident in his tactical superiority, had decided to take his time with the final assault. The British commander had learned from costly frontal attacks during the French and Indian War, and he preferred to use his artillery to soften American positions before committing his infantry. This methodical approach, which had served him well in previous campaigns, now worked to Washington's advantage. Every hour that Howe delayed was another hour for the evacuation boats to make additional crossings. The British artillery began its bombardment at 7 o'clock in the morning. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the East River, and shells began falling on the American positions. But instead of the screams of wounded men and the chaos of a defensive position under attack, the British gunners heard only the occasional call of encouragement from the American lines. The defenders seemed remarkably calm under fire, almost as if they were accustomed to such bombardments. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead fishermen continued their heroic work, making trip after trip across the increasingly choppy waters of the East River. The wind had picked up with the dawn, creating whitecaps that made the crossing more dangerous, but also helped to conceal the movement of boats. These hardy New Englanders had spent their lives battling the North Atlantic and the East River. Despite its treacherous currents, held no terrors for them. The last major units to cross were the Pennsylvania Rifle Company's frontiersmen, whose accurate shooting had made them legendary among both American and British forces. These men had fought as a rear guard during the retreat from Long Island, and their covering fire had saved countless lives. Now they waited their turn to board the boats, their long rifles loaded and ready in case British forces discovered the evacuation. As the morning progressed, British officers began to notice something unusual about the American positions. The return fire from the Continental forces was surprisingly light, and there seemed to be less activity than expected from a force of 9,000 men. General Howe himself rode forward to observe the enemy positions, his experienced eye searching for signs of what the Americans might be planning. The deception began to unravel when a British patrol, probing closer to the American lines, discovered that many of the positions were unmanned. The realization struck like lightning. The Americans were gone. The bombardment had been falling on empty earthworks, and the campfires had been left burning to create an illusion. The rebels had somehow managed to evacuate their entire army under cover of darkness and fog. According to historical accounts from the New York Historical Society, the British discovery of the evacuation led to immediate pursuit, but by then, Washington's forces had gained crucial hours that would prove decisive in their escape. The British reaction was swift and furious. Artillery fire shifted to the waterfront, hoping to catch the last boats in the crossing. British infantry rushed toward the shore, their officers shouting orders to seal off any remaining escape routes. The Royal Navy, which had been patrolling the harbor, immediately moved to intercept any American vessels still in the water. But it was too late. The last boat carrying Continental soldiers had already reached the Manhattan shore. Washington himself stood on the dock, watching as his army formed up for the march to new positions. The evacuation had been a complete success. Nearly 9,000 men had been transported across the East River, without the loss of a single boat or the capture of any significant equipment. The British occupied the empty American fortifications with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Professional soldiers could appreciate the skill required to conduct such an evacuation, but they also realized that they had been outmaneuvered by an enemy they had considered inferior. The Continental Army, which should have been destroyed on Long Island, was now safely across the river and ready to continue the fight. The psychological effect of the evacuation was enormous. British confidence, which had been so high after the victory at Long Island, was now tempered by the realization that they faced a more capable enemy than they had imagined. The Americans had shown that they could not only fight courageously, but also think strategically and execute complex operations. Under pressure, for the Continental Army, the evacuation was a miracle that restored faith in their cause and their commander. The men who had fought so desperately on Long Island now knew that Washington would not abandon them, that he would risk everything to save his soldiers. This knowledge would prove invaluable in the dark days ahead when the Continental Army would face even greater challenges. The cost of the Battle of Long Island could not be measured solely in casualties, though those were grievous enough. As the Continental Army regrouped on Manhattan Island, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Nearly 2,000 American soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured during the fighting, including many of the finest officers in the colonial forces. General John Sullivan, one of Washington's most trusted commanders, was now a prisoner of the British. The Maryland 400, who had fought so heroically to cover the retreat, had been virtually annihilated. Of the original 400 men, fewer than a dozen had escaped capture or death. The material losses were equally devastating. Artillery pieces, desperately needed by an army that had few cannons to begin with, had been abandoned during the retreat. Muskets, powder, and other military supplies had been left behind or destroyed to prevent them from falling into British hands. The Continental Army had entered the battle with limited resources, and now those resources were even more scarce. But perhaps the greatest cost was the loss of New York itself. The city, with its crucial harbor and strategic position, was now firmly in British hands. The Hudson River, which Washington had hoped to control, was now a British waterway. The Revolution's ability to unite the northern and southern colonies was severely compromised, and the British were in position to exploit this advantage. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled through the American colonies like a stone thrown into still water. News of the disaster spread quickly, carried by fleeing soldiers and panicked civilians. In taverns and meeting houses throughout the 13 colonies, men gathered to discuss whether the cause of independence was lost. Many who had supported the Revolution began to reconsider their position, and recruitment for the Continental Army slowed dramatically. General Washington, despite his successful evacuation, was forced to confront the harsh realities of his situation. His army, which had numbered nearly 20,000 men at the beginning of the campaign, was now reduced to fewer than 16,000 effective soldiers. Many of the men who remained were shaken by their first taste of major combat against professional European troops. Desertion rates increased as soldiers, their enlistments expiring, chose to return to their homes rather than face another battle like Long Island. The British, meanwhile, were quick to exploit their victory. General William Howe established his headquarters in New York City, turning the former colonial stronghold into the center of British operations in North America. The Royal Navy used New York Harbor as a base for operations along the entire American coast, and British merchants quickly re-established trade relationships that had been severed by the war. The propaganda value of the victory was immense. British newspapers proclaimed that the rebellion was effectively over, that Washington's army had been destroyed, and that the remaining colonial forces would soon surrender. This narrative was eagerly embraced by those in Britain who had opposed the war from the beginning, but it also gave false confidence to British politicians and military leaders who believed that one or two more victories would end the American Revolution. Yet the evacuation itself became a symbol of American resilience and ingenuity. Stories of the Marblehead fishermen who had saved the army spread throughout the colonies, inspiring others to contribute their unique skills to the revolutionary cause. The image of Washington, standing in the darkness as his army crossed to safety, became part of American folklore. Here was a commander who would not abandon his men, who would risk everything to preserve the forces needed to continue the fight. Historical analysis from the American Battlefield Trust reveals that the Battle of Long Island, despite being a tactical defeat, provided crucial lessons that would shape American strategy for the remainder of the war. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Washington and his staff learned valuable lessons about the importance of intelligence, the need for better coordination between units, and the dangers of fighting conventional battles against professional European armies. These lessons would prove invaluable in the campaigns that followed. As the Continental Army evolved from a collection of militias into a more professional fighting force, the international implications were equally significant. The defeat at Long Island was closely watched by European powers, particularly France and Spain, who had been considering whether to support the American cause. The British victory reinforced the perception that the American Revolution was likely to fail, making European intervention less likely in the short term. However, the successful evacuation also demonstrated that the Americans possessed qualities that might make them valuable allies if they could survive long enough to prove their worth. As autumn approached, Washington faced the challenge of rebuilding his army while simultaneously defending against British advances. The Continental Army retreated north through Manhattan, fighting a series of delaying actions that would culminate in the battles of Harlem Heights and White Plains. Each engagement taught valuable lessons about how to fight the British effectively, but each also cost precious men and resources that could not be easily replaced. The Battle of Long Island had ended, but its consequences would echo throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. The British had won a significant victory, but they had failed to destroy the Continental Army. Washington had lost a battle, but he had saved his army to fight another day. In the end, that would prove to be enough. The American Revolution would continue, shaped by the lessons learned on the bloody fields of Long Island, until it achieved the independence that had seemed so impossible on that foggy morning. In August 1770-6, the retreat from Long Island became a testament to the idea that sometimes survival itself is victory, that the ability to continue fighting is more important than winning any single battle. It was a lesson that would serve the American cause well in the dark days ahead, when the Continental Army would face even greater challenges and the Revolution would hang by an even thinner thread.